I think this is probably a good time to break off into some of the anatomy, which, may actually be some of the highest yield material for this injury. And I was just going to ask if you could just kind of go over some of the prevalent or very relevant anatomy that we should know when dealing with these types of injuries.
And then touch on like what exactly is a terrible triad injury. I don't know if we've defined it yet, but yeah, just like Jay said, we can get into the anatomy.
Yeah, well said. We didn't. Well, at first, the definition of terrible triad is a three components injury. The first one is elbow dislocation that represents a ligaments injury. The second one is radial head fracture. It can be a partial fracture or a completely articular fracture. And the last one is a coronoid fracture that can go for distal tip into higher or bigger fragment. And the elbow is a completely different joint from others in the body that we do in trauma. That's so much importance of the anatomy here. When you see X-ray and you suspect that it is a terrible triad injury, you can't just look at the bone, you can't look at the fractures. You have to imagine and you have to understand what that fragments represents, what why are they displaced like that, why that portion are fractured. And that is so much to do with anatomy, especially the ligament part of the elbow anatomy. That's so special, and I love that joint because of that. You can't treat just the X-ray. You have to treat the joint. You have to be prepared to treat the bone, the ligaments, the capsule, the muscles, all at once. Well, to begin talking about the anatomy, I would say that it would start with the lateral portion, the lateral collateral ligament that can be divided in 4 or 3 portions, the 3 parts, depends on where you reach. One of them is annular ligament that goes all around the radial head. The other one is the radial collateral ligament. That's not so important here, but the main one is the lateral ulnar collateral ligament, the LUCL. That one is the main ligaments in the lateral portion, because it's just like a net for the radial head. It supports the radial heads and avoids the radial heads to keep going posterior and start the dislocation. So I would say in the lateral portion, this one is the most important one, the LUCL. And going to the medial portion, the medial side, the medial collateral ligaments, there are three parts, the anterior band, the posterior band, and the transverse one. The anterior band is important in extension. The posterior part is tension in flexion. So when you think about the instability of the joint, the instability of the elbow, that's more common when you extend the joint. I'll say that anterior band is more important here, and it goes insert in one of the parts of the coronoid fracture, the coronoid piece. Well, beside that, I would say that there is a importance of the anterior capsule, the anterior and posterior capsule, but part of the anterior capsule inserts in the coronoid as well, and the tip of the coronoid. So that's also a important part for the stability of the elbow. And for the last, we can say about the muscles, the flexor and the extensor, that are attached to the medial and lateral epicondyle that also are important to the stability. So that's the beauty of this joint and this injury. You have to imagine and you have to go through all of that in one surgery. Sometimes you have just to fix the bone fragments, the bone fracture, but sometimes you have to go all around the bone, the ligaments, the capsule, the muscles to get stability.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, thank you for going through that. And just a recap to those who are listening, we spoke about our lateral complex of the elbow that originates on the lateral epicondyle. So we touched base on the radial collateral ligament, our lateral ulnar collateral ligament, which is very important, then our annular ligament, which kind of goes around the radial head as well. And then we spoke about the capsule and how important that is, and how the capsule inserts a little distal to the coronoid process, or the tip of the coronoid, I'm sorry. Then we also spoke about some of the medial sided structures. What I guess the next thing I would kind of like to go into, unless you have something else, would
I
be,
mean,
go ahead.
yeah, because you know what? I'm so glad that you guys are going through it as well. I mean, this is and a lot of times, I don't know, I feel like a lot of times we have these talks and, we talk about the anatomy, but it's not, I don't know, a lot of times that's not the meat of it, but I actually feel like this time there's quite a bit of what quote unquote meat involved in the anatomy when dealing with these fractures. Because just like we mentioned before, like when you're fixing it, it is pretty much a anatomy lesson. You have to go through and remember why this is important, what kind of stability is being, restored when you put the lateral collateral ligament back in place and things like that. Or so really glad that we're spending a little extra time on it. I know, just to kind of thinking back some of the questions and things that I've seen, they like to, I think it's important to recognize that the LCL, like we said, the origins on the lateral epicondyle, it inserts on the supinated crest. It's important to remember that the MCL, it inserts on the sublunar tubercle, and they kind of harp sometimes about the distance from the tip of the coronoid as well. It's like 18.4, depending on 18.4 millimeters dorsal to the tip of the coronoid, depending, what resource you might read, maybe a tad bit different, but somewhere in there. And so the MCL provides valgus and posterior medial rotatory stability, and the radial head actually is the primary restraint to posterolateral rotatory instability, and then secondary valgus stabilizer. So
Yeah.
I don't know, for people who listening, that's probably like, what are you talking about? But maybe rewind it and listen back, because I actually think it's kind of high yield. Coronoid on to coronoid fractures, because we mentioned that some too. There is some stability gained from the coronoid as well. Is known to resist posterior subluxation beyond 30 degrees of flexion, which you probably can picture in your mind. If you flex your arm up, the coronoid is still kind of hooking on to the ulnar humeral joint there. So I don't know, that you can kind of picture that one, but the other ones I think a little bit more, takes a little bit more time to really catch on. So
Yeah.
just figure we'll highlight that.
Yeah. Excellent.
But yeah, moving on. Like I say, guys, anatomy is pretty key in this one. We're going to get into some more good stuff, but definitely pay attention to the anatomy on these injuries. But moving on.